Okay, let's start. I'm going to start in the top right corner with establishing boundaries. So we have to understand when new borders and stuff are created, countries have to figure out what that means, right? Between bordering countries, what is that boundary going to look like, and how did it come to be, okay? And what's going to happen with it in the future. So when a border is created, the first thing that has to happen is to define the border. And that happens through treaties and documents, right? So think like what happens at the end of the war. At the end of a war, both parties are going to have to come together and write out whatever treaty that says, okay, you won and you lost, right? And what does that mean for the land that was granted or gained, right? So at the end of every war, that's what happens, and everybody agrees, okay, you get this land, I get this land. Even if it's peaceful, it doesn't have to just be from a war, but when borders and boundaries are created, you have to define where that boundary is going to be with everybody involved, okay? So it doesn't just have to be from a war. That's a good example for it. So after you decide what land is going to be yours, what land is going to be mine, you define it. Then you have to delimit the boundary, which means you're just drawing it on a map. Right, so once that treaty or that document has been agreed on, then they'll send out the cartographers and figure out where that new boundary is going to be, and they'll put it on a map. Okay, think like when we got the Louisiana Purchase, right? We used to be 13 colonies all on the East Coast, and then we bought Louisiana Purchase from, France, right? And we like doubled our size, our land, right? We like doubled it. And so then after it was defined, then we sent out the cartographers and said, okay, now put it on a map. And so our map changed from just the East Coast, and we added Louisiana Purchase, and then our map changed for the U.S., right? That is the delimit when they changed it on the map, okay? After that is demarcation. To demarcate means to make it visible on the land. To show where your boundaries are. So this could be like by a fence, it could be a wall, or it could be just a sign, but something that physically shows where that border is going to be, right? When I bought my house a few years ago, we were given a paper of my property that shows, okay, this land is what I now own. And it was demarcated by a fence, right? My backyard has a fence that goes up until the end of my property line and then spans, I have neighbors on both sides of me. So my backyard fence is a demarcation of my property and their property. Right? So that is a physical representation, a physical border between my land and their land. Okay, so it can be a fence, it could be a wall, or it also could be a sign. Think about like anytime you drive across the state border, you see a big welcome to Texas sign or welcome to Florida, right? That sign is a demarcation. Okay, it's showing you where that border is when you're crossing over into a new place. Okay. The last thing that you have to do is figure out who is going to administrate or how the administration is going to work for that border. Okay, so basically that means how are we going to maintain the upkeep of this border? Like who's going to run it? So this could be like checkpoints or open access. Those are kind of opposite things there, right? But if I have country A and country B, how are people and goods and money going to flow across that border? There has to be some sort of administration between that country and this country. Okay? Think about like our southern border right now. Crisis going on, right? Because the administration of that border is not necessarily being kept the best, right? Because there's lots of people who are coming in and out, and people here in the U.S. are worried about what that looks like because the administration of this border is not working how it should, how it was meant to be. The administration of that border is failing right now, right? The border to the north, a few years ago, we went on vacation in Canada. We rented a car in New York and we drove across into Canada. We passed through a checkpoint. We stopped at the Canadian border, had to show our passports, and there were officers there who had to check our passports to let us into Canada. So that officer was a government employee. I don't know if it was Canadian or American, but that was an agreement that Canada and U.S. had to come to figure out who was going to maintain that border, who was going to work that border checkpoint, right? Which is what is happening on the southern border, but there's an influx of people right now, right? So those workers to maintain the border at the southern border are just getting overwhelmed right now, okay? Yeah.
In the EU, like I heard you can just like pass through
Mm-hmm.
countries.
Yep.
So does that mean there isn't any administration at the border?
So the administration of those borders was agreed upon through the EU to have open borders. So they're not checking every border. So like when I lived there, I just jumped on a train and could get into any country, and they never checked my passport because it was open borders. Okay, so the ones that were not in the EU, that's when I did have to present my passport. Okay, but the EU functions a lot like the United States does, where you can just get on a train, get on a plane, and go, and it's fine because they have open borders. But that was something that was agreed upon in the EU on how to administrate those borders, that they would have open access of goods and people throughout the EU. Yeah.
So there is administration.
There is administration, it's just different, right? They agreed on open borders. So that open border was an agreement as to how to administrate those borders, okay? So countries will do it differently based on their different bordering countries, okay? Those agreements look different, okay? All right. That's it for establishing boundaries, how to figure out how we get our borders on a map. Now let's start talking about actual borders. So let's draw on our map. Let's jump over here to our types of borders. We're going to start with natural borders. Natural borders are borders that are not easily changed. Because these are things that are naturally occurring things in the world already, okay? Physical geography features that people don't have anything to do with. They're just already there. So I'm going to start with mountains first. So grab whatever color you want for mountains. All right, and I'm going to start, I know my map doesn't show the individual countries like yours does, so I'll try to show you as best as I can where to put your mountain regions. But the first one is going to be the Ural Mountains. It's over here in Russia, and it divides continents, okay? U-R-A-L, the Ural Mountains. So Russia goes like about right there. Not perfect, but that's probably the border of Russia. So the Ural Mountains split continents. On this side, we have Asia, and on this side, we have Europe. Okay, so this mountain range is the divider between the two continents. Russia itself is in both continents. It's in Europe, and it's also in Asia. It's mostly in Asia, but on the eastern part of the Ural Mountains to the east of the Urals, Russia is in Europe. Okay, so this mountain range divides continents, Europe from Asia. Okay, mountain ranges can also divide countries. What is this mountain range? Yep, the Himalayas. So it splits, not Asia, dummy. It's China. It splits China from India. Yep. Okay, so that mountain range is a divider between countries. That's it for mountain ranges. All right. Oh no. Gonna do orange next for deserts. All right, what's our largest desert in the world? Yeah, we're not going to draw it, though, because we're going to come back to Africa later. But yes, just so you know, Africa, or the Sahara in Africa is our largest desert, right? And we know that it also acts as a division, as a border between Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. It divides culturally Africa into two different things. Northern Africa, north of the Sahara, in the northern part of the Sahara, is Islamic speaking, or they believe in Islam, and they are Arabic speaking. Okay, so culturally they are very different than Sub-Sahara Africa, which has a ton of different tribal languages, and then they were colonized by the British, right? So they have Christian backgrounds kind of tied with a lot of other tribal religions. So culturally, the Sahara acts as a border between Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Yes.
Isn't like Antarctica the biggest desert?
Oh yeah, technically, right? Yeah, just cold. Yeah, but people don't live down there,
I was trying to tell them that.
right?
In
Hmm.
the colloquial sense, we say
Yeah. Okay, two deserts we're gonna draw in. So find Russia and China where we just were. There is a kind of oval-shaped country. Do you see it in between, like north of China, south of Russia? That is Mongolia. So go ahead and label Mongolia. No, sorry, Mongolia is a country, so label the country Mongolia, but then the desert is in the southern part of Mongolia and the northern part of China. So that is the border between these two countries. This is the Gobi Desert, Gobi. It always sounds funny. All right, simmer down. Okay, so the Gobi Desert is the division between Mongolia and China. Next one is in the Arabian Peninsula. So locate the Arabian Peninsula right here on your map. Make sure you can find it between Africa and Asia. So the bottom to the south of the Arabian Peninsula, there's two countries, right? You see those at the very bottom. So Yemen and Oman are there. And then Saudi is the big one on the peninsula. Sorry, I could have done that in my other color.
What's the other, Oman?
Oman, Do you see that on yours?
Yeah.
Okay, so then this really big desert is at the southern part of Saudi Arabia and Yemen and Oman too. Okay, this is called the Rub al-Khali. Rubalkhali. That's it for deserts. What other feature are we missing?
Rivers?
Water. Yeah, water. Rivers are part of it. Okay, we'll start with rivers, like Katie said, and we'll stay here in the U.S. So our southern border is what river? Yep, the Rio Grande, right? Separates us from Mexico. So that's a natural border, right? We said, okay, the Rio Grande is going to be our dividing factor from the U.S. and Mexico to the south, okay? The Great Lakes, another water feature up here. The Great Lakes are split between us and Canada. Similar with lots of like the seas. There are a lot of seas, especially over in like Europe and Asia, that split different countries too. So those are borders between countries sometimes, are seas as well. And then last thing is obviously ocean. So I'm going to come over here to Australia and use them as my example. Yes, which side?
Right.
Oh my God, let's use our directions.
Left.
Directions, thank you. West. The west coast is the Indian Ocean. And the Pacific Ocean to the east, right? Okay, so water there, obviously you're not changing that Australia is an island, right? You can't move that. People don't have anything to do with that. So it acts as a natural border, okay? With all of these mountains, deserts, and water features, people don't have any say in those things, right? It's already naturally occurring things in the world. And so it makes using those features easy to say, hey, that's a border between this country and that country, or whatever border it is, right? Because it's already naturally there, and it already acts as a division, okay? So these are easy ones with the natural borders, okay? The next group that we'll talk about is artificial boundaries. So with artificial boundaries, these are boundaries that are man-made. So people are the ones determining these, and that means that they can easily, or I guess they can change more easily, especially compared to natural borders. Like natural borders, you're not going to move where a mountain range is. You can't change the way a river flows, right? So those are naturally occurring things, whereas these artificial borders are created by humans. So there's more room to debate where these borders are. Okay. So first one I'm going to start with is geometric borders. Geometric. And before we talk about geometric borders, these fall along lines of longitude and latitude. In last class period, whenever I was talking about this, several kids shook their head like, yeah, they knew what longitude and latitude was. But then when it came time to understanding like coordinates and points, I don't think a lot of people knew. So I'm going to pause really quick, and we need to talk about longitude and latitude because it is most definitely 100% expected that you know what they are. Yes, I see you pointing at my door right now, right? I have longitude and latitude up so that you know which is which, okay? Latitude, flatitude is how I remember it. Latitude is the horizontal lines, and it's on a coordinate system, right? So that yellow line on my screen right now, that's 0 degrees, right? And what is that known as? The equator. Yeah, you guys know that, right? That's the equator. I'm going to put in... No, don't draw this. I'm just showing you. You don't draw this on your line, on your paper. Oh, I'm sorry. It's fine. It's okay. Just don't do it anymore. It's fine. You can have one line going through. That's fine. That's fine. It's fine. I just wanted to do a quick little side mini lesson because we got to know how this works, okay? So you have the equator that runs across the middle, right? And to the north of that line, everything up, is the northern hemisphere, right? Everything to the south is the southern hemisphere, right? So we live in the northern hemisphere. The U.S. is in the northern hemisphere, right? And it runs all the way up to the top of the map at 90 degrees north is the highest number that it goes to, right? So North Pole is 90 degrees north, okay? In the same way, it also goes all the way to the bottom where Antarctica is, South Pole at 90 degrees south, okay? So between the equator and the North Pole, you have these imaginary horizontal lines that run from 0 all the way to 90, okay? And in the same way, you have imaginary lines running to the South Pole, 0 to 90 degrees. Does that make sense? So when you see, I think someone said earlier we live at like 33 degrees north. We know that that's 33 degrees north of the equator, okay? Does that make sense? We're tracking? Okay, so that's north and south hemisphere. That's latitude lines, okay? So when you see 33 degrees north, we're talking about lines above, like horizontally above the equator, okay? All right, so then we have lines of longitude that run vertically, okay? 0 degrees is that line right there, runs through Greenwich, England, and partly through Africa. That is also 0 degrees. Do you know what that one's called?
Prime meridian.
A prime meridian. The prime meridian. I'm going to abbreviate there. It's the prime meridian, okay? So that's 0 degrees as well. Okay, so then you have imaginary lines that run vertically all the way around the globe too, okay? All the way out here, the line is like out here. It's between Alaska and Russia, and it goes to 180 degrees, okay? From 0 all the way to 180 degrees out that way, and 0 to 180 degrees all out to this side of the map, okay? So we live in this way is the Western Hemisphere, right? This way is the Eastern Hemisphere, okay? So we live in the Northern Hemisphere and also the Western Hemisphere, right? You see that quadrant that we live in up there, okay? China would be in the Northern Hemisphere, and the Eastern Hemisphere, right? So you have all these imaginary lines running east and west of the prime meridian as well, okay? I think someone last class period, I had him look it up, but we live, I think it's 96 degrees west is what I want to say. I think it was 33 degrees north and 96 degrees west, okay? So that's how you would find it on a map if you were to have a coordinate system, okay? Kind of mathy here, but it's a grid system, yes?
Doesn't each line of like longitude correspond with the time zone?
That is how they do time zones. Don't ask me how they break it down individually, but yeah, they run off of longitude lines, and sometimes it's not perfect. Sometimes it'll like jut out all weird and crazy. But yes, I believe that's kind of the idea, was to start with longitude lines, but it's not perfect like chunks all the way down. Yeah. Okay. Does that kind of make sense? Because you definitely need to know how to find a coordinate like on a map. Like that's expected that you know what latitude and longitude lines are. Okay, so longitude lines that run up and down are labeled east and west. Okay, latitude lines that go up and down on the paper across are northern hemisphere, so north and south. That makes sense? Yeah? Okay, that's important. Okay, how many times am I going to have to delete here? Oh my gosh. How many times? What the heck? That's important when we get to our geometric boundaries that we're about to talk about, if I can erase all of these things. Well, because I don't want to erase the writing that I already did. Oh, there we go. Okay, got it. So geometric boundaries are based off of longitude and latitude lines. Okay, so that's why we needed to have this little mini blurb so that we knew what longitude and latitude is. Okay, look at the map between the U.S. and Canada. You see that straight line? It's along a parallel. So go ahead and highlight that line there. The difference between the U.S. and Canada. So that lies on the 49th degree north parallel. They're also called parallels. Okay? So 49 degrees north is the boundary between US and Canada. Okay? Gonna grab my pencil color because there are several vocab terms we need to talk about with these two. So this is an example of an antecedent border. Antecedent. Antecedent. That's an example of our boundary with Canada. Anyone in Spanish? What does ante mean? Ooh. Antes is before. Yes. Okay. So this is a border drawn before settlement. Okay. So when we had fought our war with Great Britain, then later on, or I guess they fought before with, who did they get Canada from? France. They got Canada from France, right? So then we had our war with them, and we were living over here, right? We're over here on the East Coast. They had already decided that the border between Canada and US was going to go along this 49th degree parallel. There was nobody living out here in the western part of the United States or the western part of Canada yet, okay? But before westward expansion, the countries had agreed that the difference between Canada, like the border between Canada and the US, was just going to run along 49 degrees north. Okay, as far out over to the ocean, that was going to be the border between Canada and the U.S. So they had determined that before people had even moved out that way. Okay, so that is an antecedent border. Yes?
Why was like Russia and Canada's border like also antecedent?
Russia and Canada?
Yeah.
I don't know. What is that? I don't know Russia and Canada history.
No.
Where do you see that?
Alaska.
Alaska's part of the US.
No, like when it was Russia. They used to be like Russian, right?
Oh, I have no idea.
Oh yeah, Alaska was
Am I wrong?
Russia before it was bought by the US.
I don't know my Alaskan history. I'm sorry. I don't know. So thinking like continental U.S., right?
Yeah.
So that border between this mainland here was going to be on the 49 degree parallel. Okay? I'm interested now. I have to go like Google Alaskan history. I don't have the answers. Okay, another example of a geometric boundary is over here, the Korean Peninsula. We talked about it a little while ago. Find the Korean Peninsula. Label it as best as you can. North Korea and South Korea. I know that I can zoom in and you cannot zoom in. But you have the border between North and South Korea. This is along the 38th parallel. 38 degrees north is that parallel there between North and South Korea. So they're fighting this war in the 50s, right? And there wasn't really a winner. There wasn't a winner at the end of the Korean War. It was a stalemate. They said, okay, we're just going to stop fighting, and this is going to be our boundary, North Korea and South Korea, and it's going to be along 38 degrees north. Okay, so that's the dividing factor. Do you know what they call that line? The demilitarized zone. Yes, the DMZ. It's known as the DMZ. Yeah, it is heavily guarded, right? So I don't know why they called it demilitarized when it is actually heavily militarized. This is another vocab term. It's a militarized border. Oh, good. I'm glad you learned something from Call of Duty. It is heavily guarded. I didn't hear him. What did he say? What? All right, so militarized means that it is heavily guarded, right? Both North Korea and South Korea have troops there guarding this border along 38 degrees north. All right? So I know we just talked about the the latitude lines, but there can also be lines drawn longitudinally too, with the vertical lines. Like for example, the state of Wyoming, their east and west borders in Wyoming are based off of longitude lines. It's like 105 degrees west and 112 or something like that. We're not going to put it on our map, but it can also be done for longitude lines, not just latitude lines as well. Okay, so those are geometric borders. Next color, grab whatever color you want to next. But we're going to talk about cultural borders. Yeah. Yep, cultural borders is next. Okay, going over to India. Gonna underline India so that I know that I'm talking about cultural borders here in India too. So India was controlled by who for a long time? Yeah, Great Britain, right? So when Great Britain left this region, they had originally had like a ton of this area here, right? When Great Britain left, it left the people there to figure out how they were going to rule and govern themselves. There were lots of different people that lived here, primarily two big religious groups. There were Hindus and there were Muslims living in this region, and they could not figure out and they could not agree on how they were going to govern themselves post Great Britain, right? Once they left, they couldn't figure out how they were going to get along, okay? So what ended up happening is this mass migration of people to the east and to the west, into Pakistan, over here to the west of India, and what is now Bangladesh. Okay, Bangladesh used to also be Pakistan. Pakistan was split into two chunks, into two sections, to the east and to the west of India. But then later that got to be too difficult to try to like maintain that eastern part. And so it turned into Bangladesh. Like they became their own country. Okay, but these are cultural borders because the Muslims and the Hindus had to figure out where they were going to live. So what ended up happening is that India primarily became the place for Hindus, and Pakistan and Bangladesh is where the Muslims moved, and that ended up pretty much working out, okay? But it was a lot. It took a while for them to figure out like how to do this, like what was going to be best. And so these borders were created because of these cultural differences, right? Religion is a part of culture. So it is a cultural border between India and Bangladesh and Pakistan, okay? This also relates to another vocab term. So I'm back to my pencil color here. It is a consequent border. A consequent border. These are borders drawn to accommodate cultural differences. Okay. Someone like Gideon. Thank you. So as a consequence of there being such religious differences in this region, these borders were ended up being created between Pakistan, Bangladesh, Muslim, and India being Hindu. Okay, so as a consequence, they were accommodating these cultural differences between the people there. Okay. All right, now let's go to Africa. Got a lot to talk about in Africa. That's why we've left it blank this whole time. So still thinking cultural differences here. I'm going to draw a ton of circles in my color to represent the different tribal groups. No rhyme or reason, just draw a bunch of little circles to represent the different groups. In Africa, okay? These are going to be ethnicities. So ages and ages ago, we've always known there are a lot of different types of people, a lot of different groups of people in Africa, okay? For a really long time, these groups figured out how they were going to coexist, okay? This tribe was going to be separated from that tribe. You're going to have that land. I'm going to have this land. Maybe there's a tree line. You stay over there. I stay over here. But they had determined for like decades and centuries, like for the most part, pretty peacefully, you stay there, I'm going to stay here, okay? They had figured all of that out for a really long time. So that is called a subsequent border. Subsequent. So subsequent borders are initial borders that are usually cultural. Okay, initial borders that are usually cultural, and they are subject to change. So they can change over time. But these African ethnic groups had already decided where their boundaries were going to be. And they were existing mostly okay. There wasn't a whole lot of tension, I guess. Nothing crazy like it has turned into, because they had already figured out where their boundaries were going to be between tribal groups. You stay there, I stay here, and it's going to be good enough, okay? So then, next color. Grab whatever color you want to next. In comes the Europeans, right? A little bit of world history for us. Political. All right, so Europe or Africa had their borders already settled for a really long time. And then 1885, the Berlin Conference happens in Germany, okay? So at this point in world history, colonialism has already started, right? We had early colonialism had all of the Americas founded, right? Like that's how they found North and South America in the islands, right? Was because of colonialism, because they sailed west and they hit the Americas, right? So that was early colonialism. By mid-ish late 1800s, this part of the world had already kind of gained their independence, okay? So mid to late 1800s and into the 1900s is what your book calls new colonialism or imperialism, okay? So that's when we see these great European powers really come to the height, I guess, of their territorial whatever you want to call it, they're going out to take over other lands, right? That all happens like late 1800s into the 1900s. So in 1885, the Berlin Conference happens, and it is all of the powerhouses in Europe. Okay, they get together in Berlin, they literally take a map of Africa, put it on the table, and they start drawing lines over Africa because they had heard about all of the natural resources that Africa had to offer, okay? well, all of the things, any type of natural resource really that you could think of. They had gems, they had stones, they had minerals, they had oil, I'm sure. They had lots of different resources, and Europe wanted to take advantage of that, okay? So they took a map and they started carving up Africa, and they drew lines all over the map. So in our whatever color you just grabbed, that's what we're going to draw. Just some random lines to show that Africa was carved up. Africa was carved up by the Europeans. Okay, these are European colonial borders. So Africa was divided up by all of the European colonies based on the different resources that they had there, okay? So they drew a bunch of these lines over the already existing tribal borders that had been put in place, okay? So these European borders now, a lot of times they divided up tribes that were united. They had put a border right in between them. So maybe now this tribe was split between French and Great Britain colonies. Or they put in one country or one colony tribes that hated each other, okay? And they didn't get along. But based on the European borders, it shoved them together in the same colony. And that's where our conflict really starts, okay? So vocab term, again, this is called a superimposed boundary. Superimposed. Superimposed means that they're boundaries that are drawn over existing borders, which is exactly what the Europeans did, right? The tribes, the African ethnic groups had already determined how they were going to be divided, and they had figured that out, and the Europeans came in and said, well, we're going to do what we want to do, and they drew new lines all over the map, okay? So this happens late 1800s. Fast forward to mid-1900s, and all of these African colonies start gaining independence, okay? When they gained independence and the Europeans had to leave, when they left, their borders that they had drawn on a map are what had stayed. So the lines that you see on your map today, those are the lines that the Europeans made in 1885, okay? So when the Europeans left, and they left those Africans to figure out, okay, what kind of government are you going to have? Are you going to have elections to do it? Who's going to rule your country? Are you going to make laws for yourself? Now you had lots of different ethnic groups and tribes living in one country that didn't like each other, right? Because now they're shoved in this border that the Europeans made. They didn't have any say in doing it, right? And so then they had to figure out how they were going to govern themselves. So that's why there's still so much conflict today, why they can't get along, because you have all of these different ethnic backgrounds and ethnic tensions since the mid-1900s, and nobody can get along. So remember when we did the failed states index last week on Thursday, all of the worst countries were where? In Africa, right? Because their governments are so unstable, because they can't get along, because you have these different groups of people that are forced to be together because of European colonial borders that were left, okay? So that's why it's so really unstable there. Does that make sense? So those superimposed borders did a lot of damage in Africa. Yes?
Why can't they just go back to the borders they had previously?
That's a good question. I think because the Europeans had such a stronghold, and still today, as you'll read in the next couple of weeks, colonialism has now turned into neo-colonialism, which is like what happens today. There's a lot of dependence on the African countries from European like companies. Think about like there's still large companies in the world that are using Africa for the stuff that they're producing, whether it be agricultural stuff or mining things. So that reliance is making those African countries really dependent. So there's still just a lot of instability there with that. So it would be really difficult to undo what was already done, basically. Yeah. Okay, stay with me. We're almost done. Almost done. I have a couple more vocab terms that we need to talk about up here in Europe. So what we talked about earlier with open borders, we need to make sure that we know that Europe has open borders, so free movement of goods and people. No definition there, but just know that Europe has open borders. It functions like we do here, okay? And then last example, find Germany on your map. It looks like that somewhere in the northern part of your map, Germany. And I want you to put a little star right there for the Berlin Wall. Has anyone ever been to Berlin? Did you go?
Yeah.
Have you seen the wall? Crazy. Okay, the Berlin Wall is an example of a relic boundary, RELIC. A relic boundary shows remnants of a previous border. Okay, so the Berlin Wall is not still there today. It came down in 1889, but you can still see parts of it, right, Ben? Yeah, you can still see parts of it. What? Sorry, I meant 1989. What did I say? Oh, my bad. No. 1989 is when it came down. And so when the wall fell, like that division, that border between East Berlin and West Berlin went away, right? But there's still a visible image of that, parts of that wall. It came down, but you can see, Ben, explain it. What part of the wall did you see? Was it still like wall? Like was it up still?
So, like, there's like holes in the middle so that people can get through. And there's like a bunch of spray paint on.
Okay, yeah, so parts of the wall are still up and other places completely like torn down to the ground, but you can see like maybe in the road or in the sidewalk, like the bricks, right, that where the base of the wall being built up. So that physical remains of that is what is a relic border, okay? Another example would be like Great Wall of China. That used to be a border, right, really long time ago. It's not anymore. It's literally in the middle of China, right? So it's not keeping anyone out, but it's visibly still there, a part of the landscape. That's a relic border because it's no longer an active border, but you can still see it. That's what a relic border is, okay? All that makes sense? All right, this is our stopping point for today. We will keep adding to it on Thursday, so don't upload it yet. Go ahead and grab a new color for this part that we're going to add. We're going to use South America since we didn't use that area the other day. Okay. We left it blank because we need to talk about the water issues. So just like there are boundaries on land, why are you looking at me like that? No? Okay. Just like there are boundaries with countries and how you rule land, there are also rules with how you can go out into your water past your coastline, okay? So we're going to look at Peru today. There's a country about right there in South America on that coastline. So go ahead and label that because that's going to be where we're at. We need to know that that country is Peru. But we are talking about the law of the sea right now. Okay, so the UN made these rules for countries that had coastlines, okay? There is a lot of stuff that is beneficial out in the water, and countries started arguing over access to those things in the water. So the UN made these rules for countries to follow with coastlines. Okay, so this is basically an extension of a country out into the water and everything that they can do in those waters. Okay, so for the first 12 miles out, the first 12 miles is called territorial waters. Territorial waters, okay? In this first 12 miles, it acts exactly like land does, okay? So peace, security, all of that is exactly the same as if it were on land, just the first 12 miles out in the water, okay? So, like laws and stuff. So if you were on a boat and you were driving a boat in those first 12 miles and you were drunk driving a boat, the same punishments would apply as it would be driving a car drunk on land, right? It's the same rules apply because it acts the same those first 12 miles out into the water. Okay, so like policing, that is like it would be on water. Okay, so things are the same in the first 12 with territorial waters. The next 12 is where things get ramped up a little bit. So 12 more miles out is called the contiguous zone. CONTIGUOUS. CONTIGUOUS. So the next 12, this 12 is where you can enforce a little bit more rules on taxing things and ships that come within this first 24 miles. So that 24-mile radius out into the water, you can enforce like customs and taxes, and immigration laws are still the same in that 12, and you have pollution, like environmental pollution rules that apply in those 12. Okay, so like if a cargo ship were to pass within that 24 miles off your coast, then they would be subject to pay taxes for anything that's on that boat. They would have to go they'd have to report through customs everything that they're carrying on that ship, okay? That's why you see cargo ships staying really far off the coast, because if they come within that 24 miles, then they have to report basically everything that they're carrying on that ship, right? So think about those really big cargo ships. Think about all of our stuff that comes from China, all of our Amazon shipments, right, that are on those big container ships across the ocean. If that passes within that first 24 miles in whatever country, then they have to report it. They have to pay taxes and customs and things like that with everything on those boats in that first 24 miles, okay? Has anyone ever been on a cruise before? Okay, more hands than my last period. Okay, so think about, if you haven't been on a cruise, that's fine. When you go to a port in a different country, and you pull up in a port, let's say Mexico, right? We've probably all been at a stop in Mexico. When you dock at a new country, everything on the boat shuts down except for like very minimal like food, like restaurants on the boat, right? But like the gift shops, the nicer restaurants, alcohol, you can't get any of that stuff when you are docked, because of these laws. Because if you are selling that stuff, then you have to pay taxes on it. That the cruise company would have to pay taxes on that to Mexico or whatever, wherever you're docked. Okay, so it all acts like that's a literal, like that's how it works with law of the sea. Okay, they would have to pay for the stuff that they're making a profit off of. They would have to turn around and pay a part of that portion back to Mexico if they're doing that within their waters. Okay, so that's why everything will shut down. What's another example? You can't just go 24 miles out and dump trash in the water. There's environmental protections in that 24 miles. Immigration, if there are immigration boats that pass through, immigration laws act exactly the same in that first 24 miles as well. So this 24, like the first 12 and then the 24, there's a lot of rules that are kind of extensions of what happens on land. okay? It goes all the way out to 200 miles. 200 miles is our max. So this is like a total of 200, not 200 plus 12 plus 12. Okay, it's not 224, it's 200 miles total. This is what we call the exclusive economic zone. Or the EEZ is what it's known as, exclusive economic zone. So 200 miles out, everything in your waters 200 miles out is yours to make a profit off of, right? The term economic is in that term right there, exclusive economic zone. So it's to profit, it's to make a money off of, all right? There is a ton of oil in our oceans, and so countries want to use that, exploit that, make money off of it, right? But you can only use what's in your 200 miles to profit off of. There are places in our oceans where there are a ton of fish. You can use that and make a profit off of that as well. Yeah.
What if the 200 miles of one country overlaps with another?
Good question. So if it's not 200 miles between two countries, let's say it's only 100, you split the difference. So then it'd be 50 and 50 miles. Okay. Good question. Usually that is what is asked. So if it's not quite 200 miles, or if it overlaps, you just split the difference between the two countries. And you can't go like crooked either. So you know how, hold on, Neha. You know how like Chile is right here, right below Peru? They can't like come in diagonal and go into Peru's waters. Like they got to go out in their water. Okay. What's your question? Correct. Yes. Only countries that have coastline. So landlocked countries, they asked me this last period too. Landlocked countries, this does not apply to. Okay. And that is, it's beneficial to have a coastline because of how much stuff there is to profit off of, right? And it's really been growing in the recent past because people have used that to exploit and make money off of. And landlocked countries are really at a disadvantage because they don't have access to the same economic opportunities out in the water. But then we also know that hurts their trading situation too, right? Importing and exporting things becomes very difficult if you're landlocked and you don't have a water access for a port situation. Yeah. Yes?
So is the border like how far you go out, like height or width wise, is it based off of like your north and south border of Peru, for example, or like Chile, it would be more, like it would be wider because it's so long?
Yeah, so I think I know what you're asking. So Chile's, their area, we're getting mathy here. Let me see if I can explain it. So Chile has a longer coastline, right? They have a longer coastline this way, so they're going out this way. So their area, right? Here goes my math brain. 200 miles out. They have more area than Peru does because they're smaller, right? So they're just going 200 miles out this way. Was that your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Chile has more access to water, right, and the things in there. We actually, in your textbook, you'll read that the U.S. has the most access based off of law of the sea because we have a really large coastline because of Alaska and Hawaii. Okay, we have Hawaii chilling out here in the Pacific. 200 miles outside of Hawaii is also ours. Just like 200 miles off of California is also ours, okay? There are a ton of islands. First of all, Alaska is huge, way larger than what we think of it. But Alaska is huge, and there are a lot of islands that reach way out here. We have 200 miles outside that last island as well, okay? So we have a very large law of the sea access because we have so much coastline. So you'll read about that this week, which is kind of cool. Was there a question? I thought I saw a question. Okay. So this can be contentious when there are resources that countries want. Okay, so after watching those videos, we need to label what those examples were from Law of the Sea conflicts. We looked at that one here in South America of Venezuela and Guyana. So make sure you label those, Venezuela and Guyana. And I'm going to kind of put a dotted line out there because that was really the region that they were concerned about with Essequibo, because Venezuela wanted that stuff off the coastline there. And then the other big example, the videos that we watched were over here with the South China Sea. So make sure you label that. Again, lots of countries here fighting for the resources that are in the waters there. So that was a good video that we watched. Okay, so that's it for Law of the Sea. Last thing we need to talk about is choke points, another idea, I believe, from chapter 9. So choke points, we're going to label it over here. Choke points. Choke points are places, it can be land areas or water areas that can be easily like closed off. So if it's on land, think like valleys or things like that where you could close it off. But most of our geopolitical choke points are water-based. So areas that could be closed off fairly easily and would have a lot of implications with that. The book will talk about this one here in, I believe that's the Persian Gulf right there. This is the Strait of Hormuz. Yep, that is the Strait of Hormuz right there. And this one is really important because this region of the world, we know the Middle East has a lot of oil, right? So most of the world's oil is exported from this region, and more specifically through this sea and this choke point right here. So Saudi and this is Iran over here. A lot of times they don't get along, and sometimes they threaten to close off this choke point, which would be really problematic for the rest of the world because of how important that very narrow strip of water is. So because of its importance, we usually have a naval presence out here in the ocean, kind of just keeping an eye on things, because if things were to go awry, like, we would need to be there quickly. So it's a little bit of an intimidation, like, hey, we're here, we're watching, don't mess it up, don't close it off, because you would be in trouble, basically. So that choke point is really important. Another big one right now is over here in Yemen and Somalia. This is all over the news right now because of the Houthis. This is called the Bab el-Mandeb. Bab el-Mandeb. So again, a narrow waterway stretch right here, and the Houthi rebels are a terrorist group out of Yemen, and they have been attacking ships coming in and out of the Red Sea. So if we zoom out here and think about those oil ships that we were talking about a second ago, when oil leaves the Persian Gulf here in the Arabian Peninsula, it will usually go around the Arabian Peninsula, through the Red Sea, through the Mediterranean Sea, to get to Europe here, and then to go across the Atlantic over here to the U.S., right? Instead of having to go all the way around Africa, that would add on a lot of extra time. So this is, these are really important choke points this way too, because it sees a lot of traffic. A lot of our big ships go through there, and these Houthi rebels are attacking ships right here along the coast. They're based out of Yemen, and it has been all over the news lately. So this has really been picking up and has been causing a lot of conflict. So we will see what happens as that conflict kind of progresses, and what's going to happen from the rest of the world, and how that is going to impact shipping routes. At the northern end of the Red Sea is the Suez Canal here. which again will open the Red Sea up into the Mediterranean Sea and then access over into Europe. But a few years ago, if you will remember, there was a ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal and you couldn't pass through it for several days. And so that really caused problems shipping wise, because there were a bunch of boats or a bunch of ships out here that were waiting because they couldn't access the canal. And so there were a ton of ships like waiting for that to get cleared, and it ended up impacting trading routes, and a lot of boats had to go around the coast of Africa to get to Europe and the Americas. And so that added on shipping times, which then impacted the customer, impacted shipping costs and all of that. So that was problematic a few years ago. Another important one historically is the Strait of Gibraltar there, the southern part of Spain, northern part of Morocco. And then the last one that is talked about often is over here, the Strait of Malacca, between Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore right there. That is a pretty dangerous one. From the video that we saw earlier, we know that like when things need to get from Europe or the Middle East to Asia, it's going to go through this choke point here. And the video showed that too, that we watched earlier about South China Sea. We know that this is an important shipping lane to get over here to Asia and all these countries in Asia. And so lots of traffic passes through here. So that one is an important one as well. Okay. So that is it for our map. Finally, that is everything. So go ahead and take a picture of this and make sure it gets in your folder.